You've probably heard people talk about learning a language in terms of diminishing returns. That is to say, the better you get and the more you progress, the slower progress becomes. In the beginning, you're constantly learning new words and progress is rapid and constant. But that rate of progress slows and slows until by the time you reach an advanced level, it becomes impossible to make even incremental improvements without investing ungodly amounts of time. While you might see a noteworthy boost in your comprehension for the first 100 hours you immerse, if you've already immersed, say, 3,000 hours, you likely won't feel much of an increase in your comprehension if you immerse 100 hours more. Taking a look at a word frequency list for a language shows this point really well. For most languages, if you learn the most common 1,000 words, you'll probably be able to recognize 70 to 85% of the words you come across. That's a massive leap considering you're starting from zero. But if you know 10,000 words and you learn 1,000 more, you might only increase your comprehension by 1 percentage point, which is negligible compared to the increase of 70 to 80 percentage points you got from your first 1,000. But how accurate is the stance that language learning yields diminishing returns and that the longer you learn, the harder it is to improve? Honestly, it's true for the most part. Not just language, but with any skill, you're going to get the most rapid gains in ability at the start. But though this may be true overall when you look at the overall trend of your progression over many years of learning, the reality of learning during the first few years, when you're doing the bulk of your learning, is not always that simple. This is for 3 main reasons. Firstly, the more you begin to understand, the more efficient you become at acquiring the language, and the easier and more enjoyable it is to spend more time in the language, which means that you'll naturally improve faster because A, all the extra input you're able to consume, and B, because the input you're consuming will be more comprehensible. The second reason is that language learning isn't just one skill. It's made up of many subsets of skills, which means that even if your rate of progress starts to slow down with one skill, you might begin to improve rapidly in another area. The third reason is that even if it feels as if you're not improving, by continuing to consume input that's understandable, you're deepening your understanding and consolidating your grasp of the language, even if you're not consciously aware of it. So let's start with the first reason. Progress can feel faster the better you get because of the simple fact that as you begin to understand more and more of the language, getting more input and immersing in the language becomes so much easier. This can potentially lead to faster progress for a multitude of reasons. For a start, the speed you acquire language depends not only on the amount of input you get, but how understandable that input is. As a beginner, it can be hard to find content that's very understandable in most languages. So even though you might constantly be learning new words and picking up bits of language here and there, progress can still feel slow. But when you start to understand more of what you're listening to or reading, the rate at which you absorb the language increases. Put simply, the more you understand, the faster you learn. As you understand more, you'll naturally begin to enjoy interacting with the language too. As a complete beginner, when you don't understand much, it can be frustrating and difficult to keep focused on content when you might not even understand half of it. But when you start to understand enough to follow along, you become more invested in the input you're consuming, and the act of immersing itself becomes far more enjoyable. When you understand enough of the language, you can begin to consume content about topics you're actually interested in. If you're interested in music, for example, it'll be hard to find beginner content discussing this topic in any sort of depth. But once you gain the ability to understand enough to immerse in music-related content, the enjoyment you derive from interacting with a language is on a completely different level. This enjoyment and increased engagement, along with the satisfaction of being able to understand, even partially, what was until recently a collection of totally alien sounds, makes it easier to pay attention and immerse for longer stretches of time. So not only will your progress become faster because the language becomes more understandable, but also because you'll likely be spending more time consuming content in the language. This is especially true when you become more advanced. In my experience, interacting with a language, whether that's listening to podcasts or watching videos or even talking to people in the language, becomes an ordinary part of your daily experience. In the same way that you might listen to a podcast or watch a video in your native language, you begin to consume content for the content itself and less out of a desire to improve your language skills, though this is improving your language skills all the same. The more your ability to understand the language grows, the more interacting with the language feels less like a chore and the more enjoyable and engaging it becomes. And now the second reason, that language learning is not just one skill but a collection of many subsets of skills. An example of one is speaking. Like me, if you're mostly focusing on input to learn a language, you probably don't have your sights on beginning to output until the intermediate or advanced stages. Though the growth of your comprehension might begin to slow down at these stages, when you begin to output, because you're essentially a beginner at speaking, you'll likely experience a rapid leap in your ability, which can often counteract any sort of slowing down of progress you might be experiencing in other areas. In addition, I found that when I started interacting with a language in real life, my understanding and feeling for the language deepened. When you begin to build relationships and real-world connections using the language, you really get to experience the language as an actual part of your life on a more profound level. There's something about having real-life experiences in the language that you simply can't get from passively watching a screen. Apart from speaking, there are endless subsets of skills that are always ready to develop. There are the four main ones: listening, reading, speaking, and writing, but even those can be divided into subsets of different skills. For example, you might have no trouble understanding travel vlogs in your target language, but still struggle with videos about science. In that case, once you start watching more videos about science, you'll see your comprehension increase swiftly as you start to pick up all the most common keywords and phrases associated with that topic until you can understand it with ease. At which point, the rate at which your comprehension grows begins to slow. There's always a new area to explore and more to learn as long as you're willing. The final reason that I'd like to mention is that even when it feels like you've plateaued and you're not making any more progress, it doesn't necessarily mean you've stopped improving, even if it feels like you're not getting anywhere. This is only something I've really noticed in the last few years, after I reached a level where I could understand almost all my immersion. Once you become able to understand everything of what you're listening to or reading, you might naturally assume that it's too easy and you need something more challenging to improve. But I don't think this is necessarily true. When you're consuming input you totally understand, you're still learning a lot. The more you listen or read this input, the more your feeling for the nuances and structures of the language deepens. The more clearly the sounds of the language begin to appear. Your grasp of the language really starts to solidify, like freshly laid asphalt gradually hardening and molding into place. Now of course, this happens slowly over time, so you probably won't have the same experience as a beginner learning to comprehend the language. But like I mentioned earlier in the video, when you're at the level where you can practically understand all of your immersion, the language just becomes a regular part of your life. And you stop approaching immersion out of a sole desire to improve. You cease to have that biting sense of urgency. At the beginning, you're excited to get better and improve, and you're painfully aware of how long it's taking. This makes it feel as if you're not making much progress and it's taking longer than it really is. But when it's become a part of your daily life for such a long time, that nagging feeling of impatience and sense of urgency begins to decline, and immersing starts to feel much more effortless. Even though it might take longer to see any real progress at this stage, it really doesn't always feel that way subjectively. So to sum it all up, when you consider the overall progression through your language learning journey from a wider lens, yes, the overall trend you will see will probably show diminishing returns in the sense that the more you progress, the slower progress becomes. But for the reasons I mentioned in the video, it doesn't always subjectively feel that way, and you might even see faster improvements in some areas as you advance. Let me know what you think of the idea that language learning yields diminishing returns in the comments. Tell me what you thought of the video. Thanks for watching.